The men who worked for August Kane had a rule nobody ever wrote down. Don't look him in the eye unless he tells you to. At 37, he ran half the shipping routes into Chicago, and enough of the city's judges to make the other half irrelevant. And in 15 years, nobody who'd crossed him had lived long enough to regret it. But during a quiet inspection of a new, hidden northern route near the Canadian border, the unthinkable happened. His own right hand put 2 bullets in his chest and rolled his body off a bridge into the black water of the Kootenai River, believing it would be the end of the story, clean and quiet, the way August himself would have done it. But the river had other plans, and it carried what was left of the most feared man in the Midwest 400 miles downstream, past county lines and cell towers, into the kind of nowhere that doesn't show up on a map, until it left him half drowned in the reeds behind a rented cabin in Ashford Falls, Montana. And that's where Hannah Reed comes in. 27 years old, a single mother who cleaned motel rooms before dawn and scrubbed diner dishes after dark, so far behind on the electric bill that she'd started bathing in the river on her mornings off, while her big black dog Shepherd stood guard on the rocks, a stray she'd once pulled half-starved off the roadside, now keeping watch over her and her 5-year-old boy, the way nobody had ever kept watch over her. She had no idea a man was lying 20 feet away, bleeding into the mud, awake just long enough to watch a tired woman laugh with her son in the cold morning light, and feel something crack open in a chest that 4 surgeons had once called incapable of it. Every instinct she owned told her to turn around. Everything about him, the blood, the whispered warning not to call the police, the way even half-dead he flinched like a man who expected to be finished off, told her this was trouble that would follow her home. But Hannah had never once in her life learned how to walk away from someone who was dying, and that single choice, made by the poorest person for miles around, was about to cost the richest man in the room everything he'd ever built, and hand him the one thing he'd never had. If a story like this is what you're here for, do us a favor and tap that like button so more folks can find it. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment telling us where you're listening from, because we love knowing who's out there. Now let's get back to that riverbank, where a dog stood guard, a boy laughed in the sun, and a dead man opened his eyes. Shepherd's barking was unlike any bark Hannah had ever heard from that dog. It was not the sound he made to warn off a squirrel or a strange car passing by, but a rapid, hoarse growl, the kind of sound that turned her spine cold even though the sun had begun to warm the water. The black dog stood braced on the rock, his head lowered toward the reeds at the far bend of the river. And when Hannah called his name a second time, and he still did not turn back, she knew something was truly wrong. She hurriedly reached for a towel, threw on her old threadbare sweater, then told Milo to sit still on the stone steps near the bank before wading into the water that cut cold against her skin. Mud clutched at her torn rubber boots with every step. The reeds scraped along her arms, and then she saw him. A man lay on his side, half submerged in the water, one shoulder pressed into the black mud, his skin so gray that at first she thought she was looking at a corpse. Hannah froze for exactly one heartbeat, the heartbeat in which every instinct inside her screamed to step back, take her child home, and forget what she had just seen. But her feet were already moving forward, and the hand that had once learned the first unfinished lessons of nursing was already pressing against his neck to find a pulse before she had time to think. There was a beat there, weak, slow, flickering like a candle about to go out, but still there. She gently turned his shoulder out of the mud, and her breath caught when she saw the blood spreading across the expensive shirt that had been torn to shreds, a wound in his upper chest, just below the collarbone. With trembling fingers, she pulled back the soaked fabric and pressed close to see more clearly. And in that moment, she realized the bullet was not buried as deep as she had feared. It sat shallow beneath the skin and muscle, because the cold water, and perhaps the hours he had spent drifting, had slowed everything that should have killed him. That did not make her less afraid. It only made her realize he still had a chance. Hannah fumbled in her pocket for her old phone, her numb fingers dialing emergency services, but the screen showed exactly what she had long known about this stretch of river. There was no signal, not one bar. She stood there, water up to her calves, a 5-year-old child waiting on the bank, a dog growling as he guarded the trees, and a strange man slowly dying in her hands, while the nearest place with signal was miles away. Just as she was about to turn back toward shore and run for the main road to find help, he woke. His eyes opened slightly, gray as the sky before a storm, and his hand, ice cold and strong enough to startle her, caught her wrist. He was not trying to hurt her. He only held on, like a drowning man clinging to the last piece of driftwood, and from those bluish lips came a hoarse whisper so faint she had to bend close to hear it. "Don't call the police," he said, each broken word seeming to cost him the last scraps of breath he had left. "They'll find me, and they'll kill you too." Then those fingers loosened, his gray eyes closed, and he sank back into unconsciousness before Hannah could ask who he was, who was hunting him, or why a dying man was worried about the life of the person who had just found him. She knelt there for a long time in the freezing water, her heart pounding, her mind spinning between two paths. A sensible person would leave. A mother with a small child to protect, a woman who had learned through more than half her life that trouble always came with a price she could not afford to pay, should have turned her back. But Hannah looked down at that gray face, at the way, even unconscious, he still frowned like someone who had never known a peaceful day. And she thought of Shepherd, the dog she had once dragged home from the roadside on a rainy afternoon when he was nothing but skin and bones. While everyone told her she was crazy for taking in one more mouth to feed when she could hardly feed herself, she had not turned away that time, and she knew, bitterly and clearly as the rising sun, that she would not turn away this time either. Hannah waded back to the bank, held Milo close, and told him to keep a firm grip on Shepherd, then dragged the old tarp she usually used for drying laundry from behind the house down to the riverbank. She rolled the man onto the tarp with every bit of strength left in her arms, which were already exhausted from the night shift, inch by inch, pulling and gasping for breath, mud smearing her dress and coat, tears from the strain running down her face, though she did not bother to wipe them away. The path back to the wooden house was less than 200 meters, yet it felt as long as an entire lifetime, and all along that path, each time she stopped to catch her breath, she bent down and whispered to the stranger, gasping for life on the tarp, the one thing she would say to him many more times later, that he only had to hold on a little longer, not give up, because she was not going to let him die here. Getting the man into the wooden house took nearly every bit of strength Hannah had left, and when she finally managed to lay him on the thin mattress spread on the floor beside the fireplace, both her arms were trembling with exhaustion. She had no time to rest. Blood was still seeping from the wound, and every minute that passed was a minute she could not get back. Hannah told Milo to bring her the old first aid box from the kitchen cabinet, the dented tin box she had kept from the days when she was still studying nursing, the school she had been forced to leave when the child in her belly kept growing, and tuition never waited for anyone. Inside the box were only the cheapest things: a few rolls of gauze, a half-empty bottle of rubbing alcohol, a small pair of scissors, the needle and thread she used to mend Milo's clothes, and a bottle of homemade saline. There were no sterile gloves, no anesthetic, nothing a person in this situation should have had. She washed her hands carefully with soap and hot water heated on the gas stove, held the scissors and tweezers over the flame until the metal glowed hot, then let them cool, and she repeated to herself everything she had once been taught in the lecture hall she never got to finish. Stop the bleeding first. She pressed a thick pad of gauze hard over the wound, bearing down with the full weight of her palm, counting each beat in her head until the flow slowed. The bullet was shallow. She had known that from the riverbank, and now, under the dim yellow lamplight, she could see clearly that it lay just beneath the skin and muscle, not touching anything. A self-taught hand like hers would never dare disturb. She drew in a deep breath, told Milo to turn his face away and hold Shepherd in the corner of the room, and then, with fingers so steady they surprised even her, she did what had to be done. The man groaned in his feverish stupor, his whole body going rigid and then slackening again, but he did not wake. When the small piece of metal finally dropped onto the porcelain plate with a soft sound, Hannah let out a long breath she had not realized she had been holding. She cleaned the wound with saline, disinfected it with the last of the alcohol, then took the needle she had passed through flame and the thread and stitched the wound closed one careful stitch at a time, as though she were mending the hem of her son's only coat. Her hand was not beautiful. The stitches were not straight like a real doctor's, but they held the wound shut. And to her, in that moment, that was enough. She bandaged it with the last layer of gauze in the box, and when she realized she had used up the whole roll she had meant to save in case Milo fell and hurt himself, she only pressed her lips together and pushed the thought aside. That night, the fever came. The man's body burned hot as embers. He shook in waves beneath the thin blanket, and the words he muttered in delirium were in a language Hannah could not understand. Names, broken orders, something that sounded like an apology, though his voice was cold and carried no remorse. She dipped a towel into a basin of cool water, wrung it out, then wiped his forehead, his neck, and both his arms, again and again, changing the towel whenever it grew warm. She diluted the fever medicine left over from Milo's illness the month before, cheap medicine bought from the dollar store, and patiently coaxed one small spoonful after another past his dry, cracked lips. Milo had long since fallen asleep on the small bed, one arm still draped over Shepard's neck, and inside the house there was only the crackle of the fire and the heavy breathing of the stranger. Hannah pulled the wooden chair close, wrapped an old blanket around her shoulders, and sat there keeping watch. She knew she still had to wake at 4 o'clock the next morning to make it to her housekeeping shift at the motel. Knew that the dark circles under her eyes and the aching weakness in her hands would follow her all day. Knew that she wouldn't be paid a single extra cent for this sleepless night. But when she placed the back of her hand against his forehead and felt the fever begin to drop, even just a little, something in her chest softened. She did not know how much trouble she had just brought home. She only knew that beneath that gray skin and the tangle of old scars the oil lamp had revealed across his body, there was a human being, and that human being was still breathing, and as long as he was breathing, she would keep sitting there. August woke when the sky was nearly dawn, and the first thing he did was not open his eyes but lie absolutely still, letting every sense return before revealing that he was awake, the habit that had saved his life more times than he could count. He listened. The fire had burned down to embers, the steady breathing of a child somewhere to his left, the soft scrape of an animal's claws against the wooden floor, and closest of all, the slow, exhausted breathing of a woman dozing in a chair. There were no heavy male footsteps, no metallic clink of weapons, no silence stretched tight as a wire to warn him that someone was waiting for him to wake so they could finish him. There was only the quiet of a place he had never known. Only then did he open his eyes slightly. A low wooden ceiling, cracks running through the crossbeams, a clothesline stretched across the room with several worn children's shirts hanging from it. This was not a hospital, not an organization, safe house, not anywhere he recognized. His chest throbbed every time he breathed, and when he slowly lifted a hand to touch the clumsy bandage wrapped around his shoulder, he understood that someone had taken the bullet out of him, someone who did not have a doctor's hands but had kept him alive. It was then that the woman in the chair stirred awake, and when she saw his gray eyes open, she did not scream, did not step back, only sat upright with the tired caution of someone far too used to having to be careful. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice hoarse from a whole night without sleep. "Don't move too much. The wound was only just stitched." August looked at her for a long time, with the kind of stare that over the years had made even the hardest men lower their heads. But the woman before him only looked back with a calmness that unsettled him. Not the calmness of someone who did not know fear, but of someone who had feared so many things that one wounded man was no longer worth adding to the list. She stood, poured him a cup of warm water, lifted his head, and brought it carefully to his lips little by little. And when he had finished drinking, she sat down on the wooden chair, clasped her hands together, and asked the question he had known would come. "What's your name?" 2 simple words hung in the air, and inside August's mind, a machine that had been running for 37 years began calculating with its familiar cold speed. If he said the name August Kane, the name that half the Midwest did not dare speak aloud, what would happen? This woman would understand at once what she had brought into her home. And worse, if somehow word got out, if the person who had betrayed him learned that he was still alive, that he was lying helpless in a wooden house with a woman and a child, they would not only come looking for him, they would erase every trace, and in the world he came from, a poor woman and her 5-year-old son were only 2 traces to be erased. He had seen that happen. He had once given orders like that, and for the first time in a long, endless life, the thought of that happening made something inside him tighten. He still did not know who had pulled the trigger, did not know which hand inside his own empire had turned against him, and until he knew, every name he spoke could become a death sentence for the people around him. So August did what survival instinct told him to do. He shifted his eyes away, looking toward the dying fire, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse, but even, revealing nothing. "I don't remember," he said, a lie so smooth that even he almost believed it. Hannah looked at him for another moment, and he could not read what was moving behind those tired eyes, whether she believed him or whether she recognized the lie. But then she only gave a faint nod, as though a man drifting to the riverbank with a bullet in his body and unable to remember his own name was not such an impossible thing, in a world that had taught her people had every kind of reason to hide who they really were. "It's all right," she said, standing to pull the blanket over him again. "Just rest for now. You'll remember later." And as she turned away and walked toward the kitchen to prepare for the long day ahead, August lay there watching the thin back of the woman who had saved his life, feeling a little lighter because the secret was still safe, not knowing that the decision to hide his name was only the first link in a chain of things that would soon bind him to these two people more tightly than any oath he had ever sworn. By the third day, when August was clear-headed enough to sit with his back against the wall without the room tilting around him, the child began to grow braver with him. Milo was a 5-year-old boy with messy brown hair and big, round, curious eyes that seemed not to know what fear was. And while his mother was at work, he kept hovering near the mattress where the stranger lay, hiding behind Shepard and then poking his head out again to watch, until curiosity finally won over caution. "Who are you?" the boy asked at last, sitting down on the floor at a safe distance from him. August, the man who had made grown men tremble with a single look, suddenly found himself unsure how to answer a child. "I don't remember my name," he said, repeating the lie he had given the mother. Milo frowned and thought very seriously, with the funny seriousness of a child trying to solve some great problem of the world. And then his face lit up. "Then I'll name you," he announced, and before August could say anything, the boy cried out, "You're big and hairy and quiet like the bear in my book, so I'll call you Uncle Bear." He was about to object, but the child was already grinning proudly at his own discovery, and Shepard was wagging his tail as though in agreement, and August realized he had no reason to refuse a name given by a 5-year-old boy. And so the man an entire region called by names whispered in fear. The man who had dozens of nicknames built from blood and power now carried a new name, Uncle Bear, the first name in his life that held not a trace of fear, only the innocent affection of a child who had never known who he was. And the strange thing was, he did not mind. When Hannah came home that evening, worn down after 2 shifts in a row, Milo immediately ran to tell her he had named the stranger, and Hannah laughed, a sound that made her tired face brighten for one brief moment, then looked at August with an expression that was half apology and half amusement. "Once he gives someone a name, it sticks," she said. "I'm afraid you're Uncle Bear now." "Fine," August replied, and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, the closest thing to a smile he had made in many years. But what truly caught his attention that night was not the name. It was dinner. Hannah set out a pot of thin soup and a loaf of bread, gave Milo the largest portion, cut him a decent share because he needed strength to recover, then ladled herself a bowl of soup so clear it was almost only water, with a few thin slices of potato. He saw her eat slowly, very little, saw her secretly push another piece of bread onto her son's plate when she thought no one was watching, saw her say she wasn't very hungry when Milo asked why she was eating so little. August had sat at banquet tables where a single meal cost more than this woman earned in an entire month, had watched people leave behind plates of food that Milo might never taste in his whole life, and now he was sitting inside this cramped wooden house, watching a mother go hungry so her child could be full. And a strange feeling rose inside him, something close to shame, something he had thought he had lost long ago. That night he could not sleep, not because of pain, but because his mind kept circling back to that almost transparent bowl of soup. And before dawn had fully broken, when he heard the soft alarm ring at 4 o'clock and the sound of Hannah turning over wearily to prepare for her housekeeping shift, August did something he had never done for anyone in his entire life. He forced himself to stand, one hand bracing the still aching wound, felt his way through the unfamiliar little kitchen, found the cheap coffee in the cabinet, and fumbled with the old kettle he had never had to use by himself, because all his life there had always been someone else to make coffee for him. He ruined the first batch, the coffee too thick and bitter. But he patiently tried again, and when Hannah stepped out of the room in her worn old uniform, her eyes still heavy from lack of sleep, she froze when she saw a hot cup of coffee waiting for her on the table, and the large, awkward man standing beside the stove with the expression of someone who had just done a thing he himself did not understand why he had done. Hannah looked at the coffee, then at him, and something glimmered in those tired eyes that he could not name. "Thank you," she said softly, lifting the cup with both hands as though it were the most precious thing anyone had ever given her. And August turned away, pretending to adjust the blanket so he would not have to face the strange feeling rising in his chest, the chest 4 surgeons had once told him no longer knew how to tremble. In the days that followed, as his strength slowly returned, August began revealing the habits that a lifetime lived in danger had carved deeply into his body, reflexes that suddenly seemed both funny and heartbreaking inside this small wooden house. One afternoon, while he was sitting at the table, Milo, absorbed in play, dropped a tin toy car onto the floor, the sudden clang ringing through the quiet room, and before August could think, his hand instantly shot to his side, to the place where a gun should have been, his whole body going rigid in the posture of a man ready for death. But there was nothing there except the worn old shirt Hannah had lent him, and when he realized he had just reacted to a child's toy as though it were a deadly threat, a rare flush crept up his usually cold face. Milo only looked up in confusion, not understanding what had happened, then bent down to pick up the car and kept playing, while August sat there, slowly loosening each muscle, telling himself that it had been a very long time since he had been in a place where a sudden noise did not mean someone was about to die. The world inside this house operated by rules entirely different from the ones he knew, and he moved through it awkwardly, like an outsider to a faith he did not understand. The old microwave truly confused him. He stood staring at it for a long while as if it were some mysterious machine, pressed the wrong button, and made it beep loudly, then hurried to shut it off with the expression of a man who had just disarmed a bomb, and when Milo burst out laughing and showed him the right button to press, he only cleared his throat and acted as though he had known all along. Once the child was no longer afraid of him, he clung to August without letting go. Milo dragged him into all sorts of games, and one morning, the boy insisted that Uncle Bear had to be the monster so he could be the knight who defeated him, and so the man who had once made an entire hidden empire kneel was forced to crawl across the wooden floor, pretending to growl while a 5-year-old boy gleefully poked him in the back with a wooden sword. And the strange thing was that he did not mind it at all. In fact, some corner of him found it so warm that he did not dare give it a name. But he was not a man who could sit still and accept care without giving anything back. And when he noticed that the pile of firewood beside the house had grown low while Hannah was too exhausted after every shift to chop more, August quietly went behind the house while she was away. The problem was that he was not used to measuring his strength for ordinary tasks, and when Hannah came home, she stood stunned before a mountain of firewood stacked high along the side of the house, enough to last through a long winter. The logs split so neatly they were almost perfectly straight. She turned to look at him with an expression that was both amazed and amused, while August stood there, one hand still holding his aching shoulder, trying to appear as though that woodpile had nothing to do with him, his eyes fixed toward the trees, as if he were occupied with some distant thought. "You do know you only needed to chop enough, right?" Hannah said, trying not to laugh, and he only answered curtly that too much was better than not enough, making her turn away to hide her smile. The only thing that truly unsettled August, the thing he would never admit, was the dog. Shepherd, that large black dog, was adored by both Hannah and Milo, and every time Hannah bent down to stroke its head, every time Milo wrapped his arms around its neck and chattered on about everything, August felt some petty feeling he hated with all his heart begin to kindle inside him. He told himself that a grown man, especially a man like him, would never be jealous of a dog. He told himself that again and again every time he caught himself glancing at the animal lying contentedly with its head on Milo's leg. But then one evening, when Shepherd left Milo's side and calmly walked over to lie down beside August's feet near the fireplace, placing his enormous head on August's foot with a satisfied sigh, something inside him softened, and he realized that perhaps he and that dog were more alike than he had thought. Both of them had once been creatures left by the roadside, and both of them, somehow, had found their way beneath the same roof. Evenings in the wooden house had a rhythm of their own, one August slowly learned by heart, and the part he looked forward to most, though he would never admit it, was when Hannah read stories to Milo before bedtime. After the dishes had been washed and the fire in the hearth had burned bright and steady, she would sit down in the old rocking chair beside her son's bed, pull Milo onto her lap, and open the picture book with the worn spine, the one she had read so many times she nearly knew every page by heart. It was a cheap fairy tale book bought from a second-hand store, its cover peeling and several pages folded at the corners. But in Hannah's voice, it became an entire world. She read about kings and enchanted forests, about the weak who turned out to be strong and the frightening ones who turned out to be lonely, her voice rising and falling with each character, soft when the story turned sad, lively when it turned joyful, while Milo listened with wide, enchanted eyes, though he had heard those stories hundreds of times before. August sat in the corner of the room near the fireplace, pretending to watch the flames, but in truth, he heard every word, and as he listened, something inside him quietly cracked. In 37 years of life, the things he had heard at night were reports about shipments, numbers, names that needed handling, whispers about who was betraying whom, orders he gave and orders others gave him when he was still a child, pulled into that world before he was old enough to understand what it was. No one had ever read him a story. No one had ever sat beside him in warm firelight and spoken of kind kings and small miracles. No voice had ever risen near his ear without carrying fear, calculation, or something that had to be traded for something else. And now, sitting inside the cramped wooden house of a woman so poor she had to bathe in the river, the most feared man in the Midwest found himself captivated by a shabby old children's picture book, and he did not understand why his throat tightened every time a character in the story found the way home. He began noticing small details he would never once have bothered with before. The way Hannah paused at exactly the right part so Milo could guess what would happen next. Even though she knew perfectly well he already knew it by heart. The way she changed her voice when she read the dragon's lines, making Milo giggle and burrow deeper into his mother's arms. The way her eyes, though heavy from an entire day of work, still shone with a tenderness nothing could extinguish whenever she looked down at her son's face. August realized he was watching her more than listening to the story, and he had to force himself to turn back toward the fire each time he caught himself doing it. One evening, when Milo had fallen asleep halfway through the story, Hannah still kept reading softly for a few more lines, as though she could not bear to let the tale stop too abruptly, and only then did she close the book, settle her son properly, and pull the blanket up to his chin. When she lifted her head, she caught August looking at her, and instead of growing flustered, she only gave him a tired little smile. "You know," she said softly so she would not wake the child, "reading to him makes this house feel less empty. My mother used to read to me like that too, back when she was alive." August did not answer, because he did not know what to say, because in all his life he had never learned how to respond to such gentleness. He only gave a faint nod, and in the silence between them, sitting beside the fading fire with a sleeping child and a dog curled beneath their feet, something grew that needed no words, a quiet intimacy both of them felt but neither dared name. And after Hannah had gone into the bedroom that night, August remained sitting by the fireplace for a very long time, looking at the old picture book resting on the rocking chair. And for the first time in his life, the man who had never known a home wondered whether someone like him had the right to dream of something like this. On one rare weekend morning when Hannah did not have to go to work, she gathered a bundle of clothes that needed washing and a clean towel, then turned hesitantly toward August, who was now strong enough to move around the house without leaning against the wall. The hot water in the house had been cut off again because she had not been able to pay the bill in time, she explained, trying to hide her embarrassment, so she often went down to the stretch of river behind the house to wash laundry and bathe on mornings like this. And she wanted to ask him to watch Milo and keep an eye on the woods, because lately she had felt uneasy, though she did not know why. "Could you watch things for me for a little while?" she asked, her voice light as though she were afraid of asking too much. "I won't be long." August nodded before she had even finished speaking. He called Shepard to come with them, led Milo to the stone steps where the boy could sit and toss pebbles into the water, then chose a place some distance from the river bend, turning his back completely to the water, his face toward the trail leading into the woods, exactly where any danger would have to pass. It was the choice of a soldier, of a man whose whole life had been spent guarding and killing, and he held that position with absolute seriousness. But August's real battle that morning did not take place at the edge of the forest. It took place inside himself, because he realized, with a clarity that made him uncomfortable with his own nature, that the woman now trusting him with her safety had become something important to him, more important than he wanted to admit, and the possessive instinct, the instinct of a man who had spent his life taking and controlling everything within reach, was rising in him like an animal. In the world he came from, wanting something meant taking it, keeping it, allowing no one else to touch it. But sitting here, his back turned to the woman who had saved his life, August understood that the feeling growing inside him could not be allowed to take that shape. Hannah was not something to possess. She was a human being who had given him her trust without asking for anything, had placed her safety in his hands out of the simple belief that he would not betray it. And that trust, he realized, was more precious than anything he had ever seized by force. So he sat there, absolutely still, his eyes fixed on the trail, fighting himself to keep both his gaze and his mind exactly where they belonged. And each time that possessive instinct roared inside him, he smothered it with a single thought, that respecting a person meant protecting even the things one desired, without allowing oneself to reach out and claim them. This was a new kind of discipline for him, entirely different from the cold discipline he had sharpened all his life, and it was harder than he had expected. From time to time, Milo would call out to ask whether Uncle Bear was still there, and each time August answered with a low, quiet yes, his eyes never leaving the trees, and the boy would settle back into his pebbles in peace. At one moment, a deer stepped cautiously out of the woods to inspect the trail, and August's whole body tightened in alert before he realized it was only a harmless animal, but that instinctive vigilance reminded him why he was sitting there, that somewhere out there beyond the ridges, there were still people hunting him, and if they found him, the woman trusting him now would be the first one to pay the price. When Hannah finally returned, her hair still wet, and a bundle of clean laundry in her arms, she placed a hand on his shoulder to let him know she was done, and that light touch made him start slightly, because he had been so focused he had forgotten how to relax. "Thank you," she said. "You did exactly what I asked." She sat down beside him for a little while, both of them looking out at the river glittering beneath the morning sun, and in that quiet peace, August felt something close to happiness, something he had never had a name for, and he silently told himself that no matter what it cost, he would never let his old world touch this moment, or touch the woman who had just sat down beside him with water still clinging to her hair and a tired but peaceful smile on her face. That night, rain fell steadily on the wooden roof, and after Milo had drifted deep into sleep, Hannah and August remained beside the fireplace longer than usual, the warm silence between them now so familiar that it no longer needed to be filled with words. But tonight, perhaps because of the sound of rain, perhaps because of the trust that had grown between them, the needers that had long been locked began to open a little. Hannah was the first to speak, her eyes on the fire instead of on him, as though some things could only be told when one did not have to face another person's gaze. She told him about Milo's father, the man she had once thought she would spend her whole life with, the man who left when the boy was not even a year old. "He wasn't a bad man at first," she said softly, her voice carrying no bitterness anymore, only a weariness hardened by the years. "He was just weak, and then he got tangled up in debt." She told him that he had fallen into gambling, then borrowed from the kind of men no one should borrow from. Men who did not come from banks and did not hand anyone a paper to sign. And when those debts grew too large to repay, he ran in the middle of the night, leaving her behind with an infant, and a burden she had not created, but still had to bend her back to carry. "Some men still come around from time to time," she said, her voice sinking, asking about him, about the money, and I had to move several times, until finally I washed up in this isolated place, a place cheap enough that I could afford it, and far enough away that I could hope no one remembered me anymore. That's why I'm afraid of paperwork, afraid of the police, afraid of anything that might let people trace where I am." August listened to every word, and inside him something quietly tightened, a vague realization that the dark world he had thought he had left on the other side of the ridges might have touched this woman's life long ago, in a way he could not yet name. But he pushed the thought aside, telling himself that the underworld was vast and loan sharks existed everywhere. Then it was his turn, and he was surprised to find himself beginning to speak too, something he had never done with anyone. He gave no name, spoke of no empire, but he told her about a boy. "A boy with no parents," he said, his voice distant and even, as though he were speaking about someone else, taken from the streets by men who saw in him something useful. They did not raise him with love, but shaped him the way people forge a tool, teaching him how to survive, how to make others fear him before they had the chance to hurt him, how never to reveal that he was in pain, because pain was weakness, and weakness could not survive in that world. The boy grew up never knowing what a home was, never having anyone read him a story, never having anyone sit beside him simply because they wanted to, and not because they needed something from him. He stopped, and the firelight cast bands of brightness and shadow across his face, revealing for one brief moment the exhaustion of a man who had carried too much for too long. Hannah did not ask who that boy was, because she understood, and she did not offer any pitying words, the kind he would perhaps have hated. She only gently placed her hand over the one resting on his knee, a touch that was light and asked for nothing. "No one deserves to grow up like that," she said softly. August looked down at the small hand calloused by work resting over his, The hand that had pulled a bullet from his body, had made coffee for him, had turned page after page of an old fairy tale book, and he felt something inside his chest, something he had believed long dead for so many years, begin to stir back to life. Two people sat beside each other in the firelight, each carrying scars that life and that dark world had carved into them in different ways, neither yet knowing that those scars had in fact come from the same darkness, and that darkness was soon going to come knocking at the door of the little wooden house. The illness struck in the middle of the night, exactly the way every disaster always seemed to choose to come, when people were at their weakest and least prepared. August woke to a sound that turned his whole spine cold. Milo's labored wheezing coming from the small bed. That terrible sound as though each breath the boy took had to be fought for with painful effort. Hannah was already up before him, and when August came closer, he saw her face gone white beneath the oil lamp. "His lungs have been weak since he was little," she said, her voice trembling while her hands moved quickly to wipe her son down and bring the fever down. "Every time the weather changes or he catches a chill, he gets like this. But this time, it's worse than usual." Milo was burning hot, his cheeks flushed red with fever, and the sound of his breathing grew harder and harder until the whole room seemed thick with fear. Hannah tore through the medicine box, but the little cheap fever medicine left inside was nowhere near enough, and what the boy needed now, she knew clearly with everything she had once learned in nursing school, was to be taken to a hospital, to have oxygen, to have medicine only a doctor could prescribe. But when August said they had to take the boy right away, Hannah looked at him with a desperation that made something inside him ache. "I don't have enough money," she whispered. "The nearest emergency room is almost an hour away, and they'll ask for papers, ask for insurance I don't have, and they'll write down my name, my address." She did not finish the sentence, but August understood the fear behind it, the fear that a name written into records could lead the men hunting Milo's father straight to this place. And in that moment, August Kane, a man who had more money than this woman could ever imagine, a man who could buy an entire hospital with a single phone call, felt numb with helplessness, because he could not make that call. He could not reveal himself, could not leave behind any trace that August Kane was still alive, because doing so would be no different from signing a death warrant for all three people in this house with his own hand. He stood there, watching the child struggling for every breath. The child who had given him an affectionate name, who had made him play the monster so he could be the knight, who had once fallen asleep tucked against him one afternoon, and he realized with painful clarity that he did not only care about the mother, he loved the boy too. This small living soul had quietly slipped into the heart he had believed had turned to stone, and the thought of losing him brought a fear he had never known, rising up until it choked him. And so August did the thing every survival instinct in him screamed against. He told Hannah to take him somewhere with phone signal. On the hill behind the house, where the signal flickered in and out with one or two weak bars, he borrowed her old phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. The number of a man who owed him a life, a doctor in the shadows who treated people who could not go to hospitals, a man August trusted to keep his mouth shut. He did not give his full name, only said enough for the man to understand who was calling, gave a vague address and a price large enough to guarantee silence, then hung up. But the instant that number was dialed, a thin thread had been reconnected between August and the world he was running from. One tiny trace left in the darkness, and he knew it, and he accepted the risk without hesitation, because the boy's life was worth more than his own safety. The doctor arrived before dawn, silent as a shadow, carrying medicine and oxygen, and over the next few of the most tense hours August had ever lived through, Milo's wheezing gradually steadied, the fever came down, and the boy finally sank into a peaceful sleep. When morning came, Hannah collapsed against August's shoulder and cried with relief, and he wrapped his arms around her, standing there in the small wooden house with a child breathing steadily on the bed and a woman trembling in his embrace, and he knew that whatever the price might be, he would pay it again without a moment's doubt. Milo recovered quickly in the way only children can, and only a few days after the illness, the boy was running around the house again, though Hannah still made him wrap himself in a warm scarf and would not let him go near the river. To keep him sitting still in one place, she gave him a few old sheets of paper and a box of crayons worn almost down to stubs, and Milo spent the whole afternoon absorbed in drawing, his tongue sticking out at the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. When he finished, the boy hid the picture behind his back, ran to stand in front of August with shining eyes, then solemnly held it out. "I drew this for Uncle Bear," he announced proudly. August took the paper, and for a moment he could not say anything. On the page were 3 stick figures drawn in the crooked style of a 5-year-old child. A long-haired woman labeled Mom, a tiny boy standing in the middle who was himself, and beside them, much taller than the rest, a figure colored heavily in brown with 2 dots for eyes, with the words Uncle Bear written beneath in wobbly letters. There was a black dog in the corner of the picture, a wooden house with round curls of smoke rising from its chimney, and a bright yellow sun in the upper corner. It was a family picture. The boy had drawn him into his family, placed him beside his mother and beside himself as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though he belonged here. August's hand, the hand that had done things he would never dare tell these 2 people about, the hand that had never trembled before the mouth of a gun or before death, now shook faintly as it held that fragile sheet of paper. "It's beautiful," he said, and his voice went hoarse in a strange way that made him clear his throat to hide it. Milo grinned and ran off to show his mother, not knowing that he had just given that man something all the money and power in the world had never been able to buy for him. August sat in silence for a long time, his finger tracing the clumsy lines, and something rose in his chest so thickly that he had to close his eyes. All his life, he had never had anything to lose, and that was exactly what had made him terrifying, because a man with nothing to lose did not know fear. But now, holding a child's drawing in his hand, he realized that he did have something, and that realization was both sweeter and more frightening than anything he had ever faced. That night, after Milo had fallen asleep, August sat beside the fireplace and looked at Hannah. She had dozed off right in the chair, one hand hanging loosely, the needle and the shirt of Milo's she had been mending still lying unfinished in her lap, her face marked by the exhaustion of someone who had spent all her strength but never allowed herself to stop. He looked at the dark circles beneath her eyes, at her calloused hands cracked from dishwater and cleaning chemicals, at her hair that had not been cared for in a long time and the sleep clothes worn thin in several places. And in this exhausted woman, he saw a beauty and a strength no glittering woman he had ever met in his old world had possessed. She had nothing, and yet she gave everything. She was worn down to the very end of herself, and yet she had still found room in her heart for a blood-covered stranger who had drifted to her riverbank. August quietly stood, took the old blanket, and draped it over her shoulders as gently as he could so he would not wake her, then stood there watching her sleep for a long while. And in the stillness of the wooden house, amid the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of mother and child, something inside him was settled, quietly and decisively, needing no oath and no declaration. All his life he had lived for power, for empire, for the name that made people tremble. Now, for the first time, he knew he wanted to live for something else, and that something was sleeping only a few steps away from him, completely unaware that the man who had once made an entire region shake had silently given his whole heart to her. 400 miles away, in a dark room in Chicago, Thaddeus Bonner laid a map covered with notes and circles on the table and marked a new name. For weeks after that fateful night on the bridge, Thad, the 45-year-old man who had followed August Kane since the days when both of them were still young men inside the organization, had not believed for even a second that his boss was dead. No body had been found. And Thad understood August better than anyone still alive, understood that a man like that would not be so easily swallowed by a river and finished. So while the whole organization spun into the quiet struggle for power taking place beneath the surface, while others hurried to divide the territory of a king they believed had fallen, Thad silently did what loyalty told him to do. He searched, and the thin thread August himself had accidentally left behind on the night he saved. Milo now became the lead. The doctor in the shadows knew how to keep his mouth shut. But an unusual call to a remote part of Montana, a price paid in a way only someone familiar with August's transactions would recognize, all those small details, under the eyes of a patient and perceptive man like Thad, came together into a direction. He did not know for certain, but he believed enough to go. Thad drove through the night toward the northwest, alone, telling no one in the organization, because he had learned one bitter thing in recent weeks, that he no longer knew who could be trusted. In Ashford Falls, meanwhile, August felt the change in the air before there was any clear sign. The instinct sharpened by 37 years of survival told him that their time of peace was about to run out. He began sleeping less, spending more hours standing by the window watching the trail that led into the woods, and every strange sound in the night made him rise at once. But what tormented him most was not the danger drawing closer. It was the question he could not answer. who had betrayed him. On the night at the bridge, the man who had pulled the trigger had been one of his own, but August knew very well that in his world, the hand that pulled the trigger was rarely the hand that gave the order, and he had lain awake night after night turning over every face, every name inside his empire, trying to find the hand that had turned against him. And the name that kept returning to his mind, the name that hurt him most to consider, was Thaddeus Bonner, because Thad was the only one close enough to know his every schedule, trusted enough that no one would suspect him, and familiar enough with August to know how to make him lower his guard. If there was one man in the world who could betray August before he saw it coming, it was the man who had stood beside him for 20 years. The thought was like a cold blade, because if Thad was the traitor, then August had not only lost his empire, he had lost the closest thing to a brother he had ever had. And now, as he sensed someone coming closer, a part of him secretly feared that the man was Thad, coming to finish what had been left undone on the bridge. He looked at Hannah hanging laundry in the yard, at Milo playing with Shepard, and a new icy worry rose inside him. Not fear for his own life, because he had stopped fearing that long ago, but fear that his old world of betrayal was about to set foot inside this peaceful refuge, and when it did, the two innocent people who had taken him in would be standing directly in the path of the storm. August clenched his hand, and for the first time in many years, he wished he knew how to pray, wished there were something greater than himself, to beg that the person coming was not the one he feared most. The strange car appeared in the late afternoon, its wheels grinding over the dirt road that led to the house, and August was already standing by the window before it had even stopped, his whole body stretched tight as a wire. He told Hannah to take Milo into the back room and close the door, his voice hard and cold in a way she had never heard before, the voice of someone entirely different from the awkward Uncle Bear who made coffee for her every morning. And it was that very change that frightened her into obeying without asking questions. August took the gun he had been secretly keeping close ever since he was strong enough, the weapon he had never told Hannah about, and pressed his back against the wall beside the door. When the door swung open, he raised the gun, his finger on the trigger, and saw that the man who stepped inside was the one he had both feared and hoped for, Thaddeus Bonner. For one moment that stretched endlessly, the two men stood facing each other, one pointing a gun at the other, 20 years of trust hanging between them by a thread. "If you came to finish what happened on the bridge," August said, his voice low and deadly, "then look carefully, because this time I'm awake." But Thad did not draw a weapon. Instead, the older man slowly lifted both hands to show he would not resist, and on his weathered face there was not the look of a murderer who had been exposed, but a relief so deep it nearly brought tears to his eyes. "You're alive," Thad said softly, his voice breaking. "I believed you were alive." Then he slowly explained, his hands still raised, that he was not the traitor, that for all these weeks he had searched for August alone and had not dared trust anyone, because the one behind everything was not Remy Voss, the man who had pulled the trigger on the bridge. Remy was only the knife, Thad said. The hand holding the knife was Wesley Tate. That name struck August like a blow, because Wesley Tate was his longtime financial advisor, the man he had trusted with all the books, the man he had not suspected for even 1 second, which was exactly why Wesley had almost succeeded, and it was a miracle that August had survived. "He wanted your fortune without getting blood on his hands," Thad went on. "He pushed Remy to act and planned to blame him for everything. Now he is slowly swallowing the empire while everyone believes you're dead. I brought proof, everything I could gather." August lowered the gun little by little, and inside him, pain and relief intertwined. Pain because he had doubted the only loyal brother he had ever had. Relief because that loyalty had never betrayed him after all. Thad stepped closer, and his gaze moved around the room, stopping at the half-open kitchen drawer where Hannah had placed the expensive watch she had taken from August's wrist on the first night, the only object left from August's old self that she had kept, because she did not know what else to do with it. Thad recognized the watch at once, the back engraved with the words he himself had watched being carved into it years earlier. And in the moment, every piece fell into place. The man who had stood beside August through so many seasons slowly dropped to one knee on the wooden floor, lowered his head, and spoke 2 words with all the reverence in his heart. "Boss." The door to the back room flew open at that exact moment, and Hannah stood there, one arm still holding Milo behind her, frozen as she stared at the scene before her, a strange man kneeling and calling her Uncle Bear Boss, a gun still in August's hand, and a truth her whole heart suddenly tried to reject becoming clearer and clearer before her eyes. She looked at August, the man she had taken in, trusted, and quietly given a piece of her heart to, and she saw in his eyes no longer the awkward confusion of a man who had lost his memory, but the shame of someone who had just been stripped bare. "Who are you?" she asked, her trembling voice barely more than a breath. "Who are you really?" August signaled for Thad to step outside, and the loyal man quietly obeyed, closing the door behind him, leaving the two of them alone in a room that had suddenly grown suffocating beneath the weight of the truth waiting to be spoken. He set the gun down on the table, far from his reach, as a way of proving that he was not a threat to her, then looked straight into Hannah's wounded eyes and said the thing he had hidden all these days. "My name is August Kane," he said, "and I never lost my memory. I lead an organization in Chicago, an organization that does things you shouldn't know about. The night you found me by the river, I had just been betrayed by my own people and shot off a bridge." Hannah took one step back, one hand gripping the back of a chair as though to keep herself standing, and August saw every word strike her face like a cut. She had fed a man like that at the same table as her child, had let him hold Milo, had read stories beside him, had trusted him to guard her by the river, and now she knew who he was. But what hurt August most was the part of the truth he had to say next. The thing he had just pieced together from the story she had told him on that rainy night. "The men who lent your husband money," he said slowly, his voice heavy. "The men who hunted you for years, who drove you into hiding all the way out here in the middle of nowhere. They were mine. The debt that has hung over your head all this time belongs to the very empire I built." The room seemed to fall silent. Hannah looked at him, and in her eyes was an entire storm of emotions, too tangled to name. The shock of realizing that the darkness that had ruined her life and the man she had begun to care for had both come from the same place, the cruel joke of fate that had carried him to the very riverbank of the woman his world had once tormented. She did not break down screaming, did not cry out. She only stood there, and when she spoke, her voice was small, but it cut into him more deeply than any wound. "Then what were all these days?" she asked. "Was any of it real? Or was it all just a man like you playing a role to keep himself safe?" The question hung in the air, and August understood that this was the most important moment of his life. That everything he said now would decide whether he lost the only thing that had ever made him feel human. He did not make excuses, did not explain himself away. He only stepped a little closer and began to speak, his voice roughened by an emotion he had never allowed himself to show in his entire life. "The coffee I made for you every morning before you went to work," he said, "that was real. The morning I sat with my back to the river to guard you, fighting myself so I could be worthy of the trust you placed in me, that was real. The stories you read to Milo while I listened beside the fireplace. The night I went up the hill and made that call to save the boy even though I knew I was leading myself toward death. The picture he drew of me standing beside the two of you. All of that was real. August Kane is the name I have been performing for 37 years, he said, his voice breaking. The role of a man who was not allowed to be weak, not allowed to care for anyone, not allowed to have a home. But Uncle Bear, the man who lived in this house with you during these days, that is the real man I was never allowed to be, not until you found me on that riverbank." Hannah stood motionless, tears finally rolling down her cheeks, and inside her, two opposing truths tore against each other. The pain of having been deceived and a truth she could not deny, that every moment he had just named, she knew was real, because she had been there, had felt the kindness in each of those gestures, and no one performing a part could pretend to be that gentle for so many days. She did not know whether she should hate him or forgive him, whether she should run or stay, and in the middle of that conflict, all she could do was stand there and look at the man who had stripped away every layer to show her the real person beneath, a person both frightening and broken, waiting for her judgment, as though waiting for a sentence. The truth that had just been spoken had not yet had time to settle before the darkness came. The thin thread August had left behind on the night he saved Milo, the clue that had led Thad to him, was also the very thing Wesley Tate's men followed, because in the shadows, it was not only the loyal who knew how to track a trail. That night, when the stars had risen and the wooden house had sunk into a heavy silence after everything that had happened, Shepard suddenly sprang up, his fur standing on end, and the growl in his throat was different from every other time, the sound that warned real danger was coming close. August understood at once. He blew out the lamp, pulled Hannah low, and through the crack of the window he saw them, dark figures moving silently among the bushes, surrounding the house from several sides. Thad, who had stayed outside to keep watch, rushed in with a tense face, confirming what August already knew. They had found them, and they had come to make sure that this time no one would survive to tell the story. Everything moved very quickly after that. There was the sound of glass breaking. Then the smell of smoke began to creep in. The attackers had thrown something burning into one corner of the house to force everyone outside, where they were waiting. Acrid smoke rose quickly, spreading through the small room, and in that chaos of darkness and choking haze, the most terrifying thing happened. Milo, frightened after being jolted awake into a real nightmare, ran the wrong way, slipping into the back room where the old door stuck because the wooden frame had warped, and the sound of the boy calling for his mother through the thickening smoke made Hannah's heart seem to stop. She ran without a single second of hesitation, screaming her son's name, plunging through the smoke toward the jam door, her hands pounding against it as she tried to open it, while the smoke made her cough violently, and her eyes burned so badly she could barely see. August was beside her at once, and with the strength of a man who had poured all his desperation into his hands, he smashed through the stuck door, scooped Milo, who was sobbing, out of the smoke-filled room, and pushed the boy into his mother's arms. "Out through the back door," he ordered, and now his voice was fully the voice of August Kane, the commander, the man who had survived 100 battles. "Take the boy and run toward the road. Don't look back." Meanwhile, not far away, at the diner where Hannah worked, Francine, the kind older woman who had always treated Hannah like a daughter, had seen strange cars driving toward the girl's house late at night and felt that something was wrong. She did the only thing a decent person could do. She picked up the phone and called the sheriff, her voice trembling but firm, as she reported that something bad was happening at the wooden house by the river, that he needed to send people there immediately. Back at the wooden house, Thad and August stood between the attackers and the escape route of mother and child. Two men who had stood together through so many years now, back to back once more. Not for an empire, not for power, but for the lives of a woman and a child. Hannah held Milo tightly, staggering toward the back door as August had told her. But at the threshold she looked back, and through the smoke, she saw the figure of the man who had lived in her home for all these days, throwing himself into danger to buy her each second of escape. Her heart clenched, and amid her absolute fear for her son's life, another fear rose too, the fear of losing that man, the man she had not even known only hours earlier, whether she should forgive or resent. That night, the forest that was usually so still rang with the sounds of chaos, and in the distance, mixed with the wind, the sirens of police cars racing closer, had begun to rise. Hannah ran out the back door with Milo in her arms, heading for the edge of the woods where the trail led to the main road, but a figure broke away from the trees and blocked the path in front of mother and child, one of Wesley Tate's men who had circled around behind the house to cut off their escape. Hannah stopped short, clutching her son against her chest, stepping back in terror when she realized there was nowhere left to run. But at that exact moment, an enormous black shape shot past her like an arrow. Shepherd, the dog who had followed her from the house, the creature she had once dragged home from the roadside when he had been barely alive, now launched himself straight at the man, threatening the little boy he had guarded for all of his short life, knocking him to the ground and giving mother and child the precious moment they needed to escape. Hannah heard the dog's fierce growling behind her, heard the struggle, and she kept running with her child in her arms and tears in her eyes, not daring to look back because she knew that if she did, she would no longer have the strength to keep going. Inside and around the house, August and Thad fought to hold off the remaining attackers, both men pouring everything they had left into that desperate defense. August, with the wound in his shoulder not yet fully healed, now tearing open again beneath the strain of every movement, still fought with the skill of a man who had survived the worst things the underworld could throw at a human being. And just as one attacker aimed at August from behind, Thaddeus Bonner, the man who had followed him for 20 years, threw himself forward and used his own body to shield his boss, taking the bullet meant for August and falling to the ground. August shouted his brother's name, catching him before he hit the earth, and in that moment the police sirens screamed right at the edge of the woods, red and blue lights sweeping wildly through the trees, and the remaining attackers, realizing the game was over, fled into the darkness. When the police rushed in, when the smoke began to thin, and the chaos settled, Hannah came trembling back with Milo still clutched tightly in her arms, searching frantically through the flashing beams of light. She found August kneeling beside Thad, the loyal man still breathing as paramedics quickly surrounded him. and then she saw Shepherd. The dog lay there at the edge of the woods beneath a tree, that great body now still on the bed of leaves, as if he were only sleeping after a long day of keeping watch. He had done exactly what he had always done, the only thing he had known how to do since the day he was saved. Standing between the people he loved and every danger in the world, Hannah set Milo down, collapsed to her knees beside the dog, and placed her hand on the black fur she had stroked so many times, tears falling hard down her face. Milo knelt beside her too, his childish eyes wet, softly calling the name of the friend who had grown up with him, and the little boy did not understand everything that was happening, but he understood that Shepherd would no longer run with him along the riverbank. August stood motionless, watching the scene, and an emotion he did not know how to name rose inside him, because he realized something that made his heart tighten, how much that black dog and he himself were alike. Both had once been creatures left behind, almost extinguished, saved by this woman's kindness without demand or condition. And when the decisive moment came, both had chosen without hesitation to protect that boy and that mother with everything they had. The dog had taught him, through its quiet passing, the final and deepest lesson about what a creature once abandoned could become when given true love. And August silently promised, standing there amid the dying night and the police lights, that this sacrifice would not be meaningless. In the chaos as the attackers fled, one of them did not run fast enough. Remy Voss, the very man who had pulled the trigger on the bridge that fateful night, the man who had thrown August into the Black River and believed with certainty that he was dead, now stumbled at the edge of the woods while trying to escape. And when he looked up, he saw August Kane standing towering before him, a gun in his hand aimed straight at him. Remy went still, his face white as though he had seen a ghost, because he was facing the man he thought he had killed with his own hand. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath. August stood there, his finger on the trigger, and in that moment his whole old life rose up, roaring for satisfaction. This man had betrayed him. This man had fired 2 bullets into his chest. This man was one link in the conspiracy that had dragged darkness all the way to the peaceful wooden house, had made Milo tremble in terror amid the smoke, had made Thad fall, had taken the life of the loyal dog. In the world August had lived in for 37 years, there was only one answer to a betrayal like that, and his finger tightened on the trigger, every old instinct urging him to end it right here, cleanly and decisively, exactly the way August Kane had always done. Remy closed his eyes, waiting for the ending he knew he deserved. But at that exact moment, a sound cut through the night and pinned August in place. Milo's crying. The boy, standing not far away in his mother's arms, was sobbing as he called his dog's name, and that small, broken sound made August turn his head. He saw Hannah holding her son tightly, one hand covering Milo's eyes so the boy would not have to see the scene before them, and her eyes, the eyes that had saved him, were looking at him not with fear or resentment, but with a silent plea. "Don't," those eyes said. "Don't let my son see you become something he will have to fear. Don't let all these days become a lie." And in that moment, August Kane had to face the real question, whether the decision he had silently made on the night he watched Hannah sleep, the decision to choose a human life over an entire empire, had been only a beautiful passing thought, or something he truly dared to live and die for. Because pulling the trigger now would be easy. It was his old self, his instinct, the habit of an entire life, but lowering the gun, choosing to let justice pass judgment instead of taking revenge with his own hand, choosing to become a man that boy could still lift his head and call by an affectionate name, that was the hardest thing he had ever had to do. August looked at Remy trembling at his feet, then looked back at the woman and the child, and slowly, with every bit of will inside him, he lowered the gun. "You're not worth losing them over," he said quietly to Remy, his voice carrying no hatred now, only a cold finality. Then he turned toward the police officers who had just approached, placed the gun on the ground, raised his hands, and did the thing the old August Kane could never have imagined. He handed Remy Voss over to the law, stating that this man was part of a much larger conspiracy, and in that act, he did not merely surrender an enemy. He surrendered the old self he had been. Hannah watched him lower the gun, and amid all the tears and loss of that night, something inside her, the thing that had been torn between forgiveness and resentment for hours, finally tipped to one side, because she had just seen with her own eyes a man choose love over hatred, choose light over darkness, at the most fragile boundary between the two men he could become. The weeks after that night passed like a whirlwind that that Hannah could only watch from the edge. August Kane did not return to Chicago to reclaim his empire the way the underworld thought he would. Instead, he did something no one had ever imagined a man like him could do. He sat down across from federal agents, and he told them everything. Every name, every network, every ledger Wesley Tate had used to swallow the organization whole, everything he knew after 37 years of living in darkness, he laid it all out beneath the light. Wesley Tate was arrested along with almost the entire network he had just taken over. And the empire August had spent so long building was dismantled piece by piece by the very hands of the man who had created it. It was a true abdication, not a king returning to his throne, but a king smashing the throne with his own hands. But speaking to the authorities meant August Kane became the #1 target of every person still left in that world. And that also meant anyone close to him would be in danger. So he negotiated one condition. Not for himself, but for mother and child. With the agent's arrangements, August Kane, on paper, was dead. The name that had once made an entire region tremble was erased from the world. And in that arrangement, every debt the organization had once hung over Hannah's head, the chain that had driven her into hiding for so many years, disappeared with it, wiped clean without a trace, as though it had never existed. Thaddeus Bonner, the loyal brother who had taken a bullet for him, survived after many hours of surgery. And when he woke, the first thing he did was smile and say that he had been right, that he had always known his boss was still alive. But before August had to leave with the agents to complete the long investigation process and begin a life under a new name, he left Hannah something. Not a goodbye spoken aloud, because he was a man who had never learned how to say farewell, but a letter, clumsy lines written by a man who had never written down his feelings before. In the letter, he did not ask her to forgive him, did not promise that he would return. He only wrote that she and Milo had shown him the man he might have been able to become, and that he owed her a debt he could never fully repay. Along with the letter was a sum of money, enough for her to pay off everything, and return to the nursing school she had been forced to leave so many years before. "This is not to buy you," he wrote, "and it is not pity. My world took too much from you, even the years that should have belonged to you. I am only returning a small part of what was stolen. Use it to become the person you have always wanted to be." Hannah read that letter many times, and she could have refused, could have thrown the money away out of pride, but she understood that accepting it was not receiving a favor, but taking back what had always been hers. And she did the thing she had always longed for, but had never dared dream of. She went back to school. The months that followed were not easy. She studied and worked and raised her son all at once, and there were nights when she sat studying until late with her eyes heavy, just like the nights she had once stayed awake, caring for a stranger by the river, but this time she stayed awake for her own future. And day by day, the woman who had once had to bathe in the river, because she could not afford the utility bill, slowly became the person she should always have been able to become, not because anyone handed it to her, but through her own hands and her own will. When she held her nursing degree in her hands after all those interrupted years, with Milo standing beside her, she knew she had learned to stand on her own feet, no longer the woman who only knew how to give in hardship, but the woman who had found her whole life again. 3 years had passed since the night darkness came to the wooden house by the river, and on a clear spring morning, the old river bend once again glittered beneath the gentle golden sunlight after the night rain. But this time, everything was different. The man sitting on the rock by the riverbank was no longer the blood-covered fugitive who had drifted here all those years ago, but a free man, carrying a new name, his hands washed clean of darkness, his hair touched with a few more silver strands at the temples that made his face look far gentler than before. He sat there with his back to the water, keeping watch for Hannah as he had once done on that fateful morning years earlier. Only now he did it not with the wary instinct of a killer, but with the tenderness of a man guarding his small happiness. Beside him, a young black dog lay curled up, shepherd's offspring, kept by a family in the area from the last litter and given to them, carrying within him the blood and the watchful spirit of the loyal friend who had fallen years ago. And the name he bore was also meant to honor that faithful dog. Milo, now 8 years old, taller and bright-eyed, was running along the riverbank, throwing a stick for the puppy to chase, his laughter ringing across the valley, and when he ran past the man on the rock, he called him by a word the man had never dared dream he would hear in his life. A simple, warm dad, a title more precious than every honor an entire empire had once laid at his feet. That morning, before they came out to the river, he had made coffee for Hannah, the way he had done every day for the past 3 years. And by now he made it very well. No longer the clumsy, bitter pot from that first morning, because it was those small, ordinary things, not power or money, that now defined the man he had become. When Hannah returned to the bank, her hair still touched with dampness, she sat down beside him, and together they quietly watched their son and the little dog playing beside the river that had witnessed everything. "You know," Hannah said softly, "back then I thought I had saved a stray dog and a dying stranger by the river." The man turned to look at her, and in his eyes was the gratitude of an entire lifetime. "It turns out," she continued, gently resting her head on his shoulder, "that we saved each other, because sometimes fate does not come with gunfire and power, but on an ordinary morning after rain, when a person, no matter how exhausted, still cannot bring herself to turn away from someone who needs saving, and when a man who thought he had lost all humanity is seen for the first time not as a terrifying monster, but as a human being worthy of love." This story leaves us with something simple yet profound, that sincere kindness, even when offered by the poorest among us, still has the power to soften hearts that seem to have turned to stone, that a person's dignity does not lie in the wealth or power they hold, but in the way they treat the vulnerable lives around them, and that true change always requires the courage to let go of the person we used to be and face the price of a new beginning. Each of us, no matter what wounds we carry, deserves to be seen as human, and each of us is capable of choosing light instead of darkness. If the story you have just heard has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share so you can listen to many more meaningful and compelling stories every day. How do you feel about this story? About Hannah, about August, and about the loyal dog shepherd? Please leave a comment and share the feelings that come from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your voice. We wish everyone listening to this story good health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every day. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next videos.